And so where you see these platforms, where you see these artillery pieces, these are all relevant to the second battle, not the first battle per se. So pretend these things aren't here, although I will be referring to some of the artillery. Again, that cannon, that bigger one in the middle, that's a light 6-pounder. And the British line here had 4 of those, the ones in the middle, paired up in groups of 2. So at about 2:30 in the afternoon, between then and 3 o'clock, 2 of the 3 British regiments, the 62nd and the 21st, advanced south. Now they had seen within the wood line American forces start to gather, but the Americans were not coming out of the wood line. The Americans were staying in the woods on the edge, were not coming out because they saw that they were terribly outnumbered by the British, but they were there nonetheless. And so these 2 British regiments advanced south, coming in the direction of that height. You see that hill over there? That was wooded at the time of the Battle of Freeman's Farm. It was cleared by the time of the second battle, but cleared at the time of the first battle. And that's where about 300 American Continentals were standing by, basically to observe the British and see what they were going to do. Well, now they're advancing. And either through serendipity or just good timing, or planned timing, I should say, out of the woods comes the 1st New Hampshire Regiment, commanded by Colonel Joseph Silly. The 1st New Hampshire Regiment comes out of the woods just as these 2 British regiments are advancing, and now at about 3 o'clock or so, you have the battle proper begin. The main phase of the battle, which lasts until the battle's end. The Battle of Freeman's Farm, as I mentioned to some other folks earlier, was one of the longest land battles of the entire Revolutionary War. And it's incredibly difficult to describe how everything happened because, frankly, there's a lot we just don't know. I think it was the Duke of Wellington years later, in the 19th century, right, fought Napoleon. He said that in order to describe a battle, to try to describe a battle is like trying to describe a minuet. You know, it doesn't translate well. A lot of things happen where you just don't remember, you know, you're in it, and obviously you're not omnipotent, you don't know everything that's happening, you just have your own perspective. And then there's memory involved and timing, you can't maybe remember what happens when. But there are some things that we absolutely do know, and so that's what I'll be talking about here. So the battle begins between the 1st New Hampshire Regiment and the 62nd Regiment of Foot. The fight that happened somewhere right here where we're standing between these 2 battalions lasted about 20 minutes. After which one of the ensigns of the 1st New Hampshire Regiment wrote in his journal later that day, he said that we had suffered so many casualties amongst our New Hampshiremen that we had to break and retreat back into the woods. So they were bested by the British. The 1st New Hampshire Regiment goes back into the woods along the path back to where they were encamped. It would have been where the Nielsen House is, that hilltop at stop number 2 with the Nielsen House. That's where they were going. But then along the way, they encountered a reinforcement. You see, Benedict Arnold, right, he had sent out the riflemen, he had sent out the light infantry. The riflemen were broken, thanks to Fraser outflanking them with his surprise reinforcement of a few hundred troops. And so Benedict Arnold thought, whoa, those riflemen might be in peril. Gates said I can support them if necessary. I better do so. So Arnold had sent the 1st New Hampshire Regiment. But Arnold was sensing that that might not have been enough of a reinforcement. So he then sent the 3rd New Hampshire Regiment. Yeah, they skipped over the 2nd Regiment. They went right to the 3rd New Hampshire Regiment, commanded by Colonel Alexander Scammell. And the 3rd New Hampshire Regiment was marching out. And as the 3rd New Hampshire Regiment's marching toward here, they encountered the 1st New Hampshire Regiment retreating, and Colonel Scammell was able to convince Colonel Silly to make a U-turn and come back here to Freeman's Farm. As Colonel Scammell told him, we've been sent by Arnold, and I have a battalion of Connecticut militia behind me, commanded by Colonel Thaddeus Cook. So we're really going to be able to bolster our line nicely. And so Silly and Scammell and Cook, they arrive on the field. You've got the 3 regiments, the 1st New Hampshire Regiment, the 3rd New Hampshire Regiment, and Colonel Cook's Connecticut militia. And now the 62nd Regiment, they got about 400 guys. Now they're facing a force almost 3 times their number. That's not going to play well in their favor. But what do they got that the Americans don't? Cannons. Remember those? They got 2 cannons with them. So the British Royal Artillerymen, what they're going to do is they're going to fire their cannons out at the American lines. Now the Americans are going to receive a couple of these shots, but they're very quickly going to go into the wood line, and they're going to take station behind the trees. According to one Royal Artillery officer later after the battle, he writes saying that their artillery fire often had no effect except amongst the limbs of trees. That's what he said, because the Americans smartly used the tree line for cover. As for the projectiles that the British were using from their cannons, yes, they would fire solid iron balls, but they also had what was called case shot. Imagine like a tin can full of little tiny cannonballs about 3/4 of an inch in diameter, all loose. So it's like canister shot, except not with musket balls, but rather small little cannonballs. Again, 3/4 of an inch in diameter. That's what you'd shoot out of a 6-pounder. And those things, those shots, are spraying iron projectiles into the woods. But again, the Americans, yes, of course, some Americans will be hit by these, but the trees are giving them good cover. However, the Americans from the tree line are able to shoot out at the more or less open field. Yeah, you had girdled trees all over the place, but it's not like it's a forest with big tree trunks blocking projectiles. So the British are the ones that are really getting vested here as this firefight happens. And so what do the British do? They're going to go into the woods. Now, despite what the stereotypes tell us, the British were actually trained by this point to fight in the woods. Again, no experience with this army, this particular army that Burgoyne had under his command. The troops fighting here were not particularly experienced, neither were their officers, but they had training at what they called treeing. That's what they called it. In other words, the command would be to tree, and the soldiers would split up in pairs like firing teams, and they would rush to the nearest tree and get behind the trees and kind of use the trees for cover like the Americans were doing. And so the British did this very thing. What did the Americans do? The Americans fall back deeper into the woods. It really helps keeping you more out of the line of fire from that artillery. So the British, they're going to go deeper into the woods to chase the Americans down. If you remember how many numbers we're dealing with for both sides, you might see that there's a problem with this tactic. The tactic's fine, but the imbalance of the two sides is going to mean that the Americans have the upper hand because they had almost 3 times the number of soldiers that they were fighting against in the woods. So the Americans draw the British in, the British chase from tree to tree, right? And then the Americans turn the tables. The Americans then are going to chase the British out of the woods. According to one British officer, he wrote later saying that those who had been most forward in their advance were the first to fall. He's talking about his own British soldiers. And so the British are going to tumble out of the tree line, and the Americans are going to go right up to that tree line and fire at the British here out in the open. And of course, many British soldiers are going to fall as casualties from this. The battle goes like this, according to one eyewitness, 6 times back and forth during the course of the afternoon of the 19th of September. 6 times the British try their best to go into the woods to flush out the Americans, and they can't, simply because of the lack of a good force to space ratio. But Arnold isn't done. He sends in the 2nd New Hampshire Regiment, and although Cook's battalion of Connecticut militia has taken on so many casualties, they have to retreat. They are in fact replaced by a reinforcement of Massachusetts Continentals that Arnold had brought to the field. Now Arnold himself is not like here on a horse commanding or charging at the enemy with sword drawn. He's not here physically, but he is between the camp and the battlefield. He's using his mounted aides and a cavalry unit of Connecticut militia, which has the moniker of Arnold's horse. They're riding back and forth between the front lines and him to give him intelligence, to give him information about what's going on. And so Arnold can then make good decisions based upon their observations. Although Arnold does come out a couple times to see the battle himself take place, but he is never actually physically in the fight. So he is not personally in danger at any time in this battle of Freeman's Farm. I think you know in the second battle the case is quite different, but not in the first battle. So this back and forth rages on throughout the day. As for other elements of the Army, I talked about that other regiment, the 21st Regiment of Foot. They got engaged as well with some other reinforcements that Arnold had sent kind of more to the west, specifically the rest of Poor's Brigade. That would be the 2nd and 4th New York Regiments, another battalion of Connecticut militia commanded by Colonel Jonathan Latimer, and then all of Leonard's brigade. They're going to go after Frazier's column. And so you have a lot of fighting occurring to the west of here in woods and in another farm field called the Marshall Farm, which was like a next door farm to here. But the amount of fighting, the amount of casualties, the amount of time engaged paled in comparison to what was happening here throughout hours and hours of the afternoon of the 19th of September. So what we'll do now is we'll go right to where that truck is.